Maybe too, if you start by giving us a few touch points or touchstones on issues the studio's addressing, I can
Yes.
begin to maybe hit some of those in the work, because I will start by saying I know nothing about the Amazonia.
Yes.
And in some ways, the sorts of issues that I think are being highlighted there, and
Yeah.
the work in the studio in some ways is very unfamiliar to me, even though there's certain resonances with the work. And I'll also say that the work that I'm doing probably doesn't directly jive with it, but I want to try to hit on some of the thematics in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that what is important to us in terms of also weaving across North and South, we're definitely trying to weave the Western world with the indigenous world. And there are tons of people who are doing it already. You mentioned Donna Haraway. I think that many of her ideas are Native American in origin, even if that origin may be so remote at this point in the history of ideas that we forget that the origin is Native American. But I feel that on the one hand, we're trying to weave these two ontologies, these two cosmovisions, these two ways of being in the world. One that addresses nature as a resource and treats it as a resource, and another one that has no word for nature, does not see it as an other in any way, and in which the society of nature includes all beings, including rivers, rocks, mountains, and every single one of them has the status of a human and agency. So it's a very different way of understanding society, and it's definitely a kinship, because often for Amazonians, a waterfall is an ancestor. So it's definitely kinship. It's literally a relative, or a river, or a rock. So there's this profound and intense notion of kinship. Nevertheless, the way we have been addressing Amazonia from the perspective of the systems of national planning in Latin America, but also from the corporations that are requesting, for many territories to open up so that they can tap into the resources, has meant that in the last, I would say since the 70s, Amazonia has been predominantly addressed as a site for industrial development, especially extraction of natural resources. And oil has advanced profoundly, and it's still advancing. The oil frontier keeps growing, and all the oil technology comes from the US. So for example, in the specific case of Ecuador, if I overlook Peru and Bolivia and Colombia and other countries where oil is also being extracted in Amazonia, it was Texaco, so it was directly technology from Texas being transplanted. And here, Bruno Latour comes to mind in terms of these standards, these protocols that are transplanted into the tropic for industrial extraction of oil. And the outcomes are, of course, absolutely catastrophic, but they've been catastrophic everywhere. So the soil's contaminated with oil, the water, the air, because they burn the methane that is produced in the process of extracting the oil. And I understand that from an ecological and biological standpoint, doing bioremediation in Amazonia is probably a very different process than doing bioremediation in Texas or elsewhere in the US. But since the US has had this technology for much longer and has already experienced the environmental destruction that it generates, I feel that the US has advanced further in terms of remediating and recovering these landscapes. And it has many post-industrial sites that have already had successful stories of regeneration, reactivation. And I feel that both you, Chris, and you, Alex, have been part of this story in America. So I think that Latin America has a lot to learn from the US, and it has to develop its own, with collaborations, of course, its own models for tropical remediation of oil industrial sites. And that's why we are looking forward to listening to you and learning from you and from your own experiences undertaking these processes here at home.
Great. Perfect. Well, that's very, very helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for that. All right, I will share screen, hoping that works for everybody.
Yes, perfect.
Great. So in a lot of ways, I think given the way that you've outlined that, you can begin to think of my talk as starting to address some of the broader climate issues that we're all facing around the world, the ways in which landscape might begin to address these in very specific ways. But you might also think about this as a series of projects and strategies that maybe sit alongside some of what you're doing in studio, but maybe there's something of the kind of ethos or thinking behind them that could be productive in a number of ways for you. So with that, I think so much of what we're all doing, so much of what you're doing sits against what Nina Marie Lister, the ecologist and colleague and collaborator, would call a polycrisis. There's not just one issue at stake, but actually there are many, many, many issues at stake. And they have different expressions, different outcomes, different impacts on people and species and environments around the world. In a number of ways, certain places are dealing with too much water these days, whether it's from increasing intensity and frequencies of storm events, and Hurricane Katrina was just the beginning of these many, many years ago, and the consequent impact on people in urban environments, seen through the lens of New Orleans, was very, very evident. But these kinds of issues are being felt quite regularly in other places like Boston, where the king tide really every couple months already is overflowing the embankments of historic wharves and piers along the waterfront. In other areas, there's an incredible lack of water. You've probably heard about the water crisis in the desert Southwest along the Colorado River and with all the aquifers and basins there. There are many, many places that are suffering from a radical historical lows in terms of water supply. What does that mean in terms of drinking water supply, in terms of water needed for biodiversity, and in terms of food supply as well? There's also an intensification of the occurrence of wildfires, this one in the hills around Los Angeles, but we've also seen this in Australia and other places around the world as well. There is a biodiversity loss that goes along with this. Richard Weller and his colleagues documented cities across the world, biodiversity hotspots, he called them, where biodiversity loss is at critical levels, Los Angeles being just one of them, but where critical species formerly endangered are now extinct. And the extinction process is just accelerating and amplifying. With that too, you see other effects of climate change being extreme heat. As you all know, urban cities exacerbate heat. We have heat rising, and then that heat rise is then amplified through urban environments and heat island effect. And so all of these forces are starting to coincide and commingle. Unfortunately, those who are least able to deal with those changes are affected the most, whether it's because of political power, often because of race or ethnicity, certainly because of income level. But you see a confluence of issues where the poorest folks who come from racially and ethnically diverse backgrounds live in some of the places with the fewest amount of trees, with the highest effects of heat island effect, with public health issues that result from breathing bad air. And all of these issues are sort of really concentrated in ways that are frankly unjust, and are really focused on those again who can least deal with it. So within the context of this, the question is what to do. I think the starting point is to shift focus a little bit conceptually. The idea of understanding that what we know as nature and environment is a modern Western construction, and that other cultures, indigenous cultures, as you were saying previously, actually have a much different understanding of the way in which the relationship to environment. Many Native American cultures, for instance, regard other animals, other creatures as family, as brothers and sisters. In fact, they understand the world as family, as part of their being. And so that's a radically different starting point that would lead to different ways in which we might work with the environmental forces that we see out there. There are other ways to just understand better what are the forces that are at work within the environment, and how is it that we may work with them in ways that perhaps lead to different kinds of effects. And that's where the efficacy of landscape comes in and the power of landscape comes in, to begin to address these broader issues from different starting points and in different ways. And of course, many of you know that our practice from the start has really focused in on this question of how landscape itself might play a more prominent and formative role in the making and reimagining of public spaces, infrastructures, entire cities, and by extension to the work that you're doing, larger scale territories as well. So much of that is based on an understanding of how to better unlock environmental dynamics and processes, to work with them as we begin to think through projects, think through processes like climate change, and how our projects may better embed shorter and longer term cycles that are dynamic and that work with these systems in process. In this way, landscape, you probably all know this, can clean air, can clean soil, can clean water, but there are ways in which that we can work with the dynamics of water, even in extreme situations with sea level rise and storm surge and the anticipation of flooding, even within tight urban sites like this. How is it that we work with those dynamics to begin to imagine new kinds of futures? And so I want to talk to you about a few different kinds of projects that are embedded in the work that we're all doing, with the hope again that you think of this as a parallel set of studies to the work that ultimately you're doing. And we'll start with a number of projects that feature constructed wetlands on the one hand, but also look to implant biodiverse tree canopy within urban spaces. Wetland carbon sequestration is actually quite critical. The role that wetlands play here in terms of carbon sequestration is probably undervalued and can be amplified. I'm not going to go through the science of all this. You probably learned it, some of this in grammar school. But the role that wetlands can play to cool the environment, to clean air, to clean water, to clean soil, to reinaugurate biodiverse dynamic conditions and cycles, and most importantly, perhaps to sequester carbon that's constantly being lost to the atmosphere, really absolutely critical. And so there are a number of projects that start to address this very directly, but in different kinds of ways. in Milwaukee, even on the most urbanized sites, the most heavily impacted sites, there are opportunities to start to re-inaugurate these dynamics. This is a site that at one point in time was the confluence of three rivers in rich marshland as those rivers emptied into Lake Michigan. This is in the upper Midwest of the US. And the idea simply here on this very small site was to re-inaugurate some of those dynamics, to find ways to clean water, to find ways to grow new forests within the city, and to create a space for people along the waterfront. A critical part of it was the role that a small forest can play, even on a very tiny site. This is a grove of poplar trees that on the one hand really are beautiful when activated by the wind. Their leaves sort of flicker, if you will, but they're playing a role here too in terms of sheltering the site from the wind, allowing people to inhabit this space. And this is a forest, a grove that really changes quite dramatically over time. It's actually growing, starting to grow in relationship to the wind, and you can begin to see the way in which some of the tree trunks themselves are slowly bending in response to some of the forces that are out there. You can also begin to see the ways in which people start to inhabit this urban grove in ways that they might not otherwise inhabit a space like this. And so certainly the grove of trees is playing an important role ecologically, but also socially. But the heart of the project is this wetland. You can call it a wetland restoration, if you will, but the idea was to open up the site, create permeability on the site, allowing water to infiltrate the soil, clean some of that, but also capture overland flow in this area to the lower right to re-inaugurate, to reinstitute a native marsh here. But you can see this marsh is being flooded from two directions. On the one hand, it will flood during rainstorms, and it's also designed to flood when the water is very high here. So that the whole idea, even in this really tiny site, is to begin to understand how to work with the systems in play, even when those systems are really radically altered, in order to create a new set of dynamics, but also to create a new set of habitat opportunities and new relationships between people, and in this case, environmental cycles. So that wetland actually changes quite dramatically over the course of the seasons. This is a fall view you're looking at. This is more of a summer view when a lot of the plants are flowering. Again, a late fall, almost early winter view here. So there's something about the simple expression of the changing plant material that begins to create connections between people and environmental cycles. But it's also those moments where water takes its space back within the urban environment that I think are also critical. Here again, a winter view as well. And so all of this is actually contributing toward better quality water, better quality habitat, but also better, more integrated relationships between people and natural resources that are out there. The second project at Gearstacker Grove. This is on the North Campus of the University of Michigan. On the one hand, it's a project that rethinks the campus quadrangle instead of a flat piece of lawn with simple straight paths that get people from here to there as quickly as possible, and creating setting for buildings for people to look at. This quadrangle really starts to rethink the role of the campus quad as a place for social activation and for biodiversity on campus. You can begin to see a number of the existing trees, new trees like these amelanchiers that have been planted to create, I think, total of over 200 trees in 4.5 acres to create a different kind of space. You can also see the way in which simple pathways were bent to slow people down, that seats and seat walls were integrated to encourage people to linger and stay, and to really get kids out of the engineering labs and libraries, to get them into a social space, to get them outside the classroom building. But again, the heart of this project is also a constructed wetland where we took a couple constraints. One was we had to collect 95% of the stormwater falling on the site, but we also had a very clay soil, which meant that we couldn't infiltrate the ground very quickly. And so what that meant is we had to have fairly large spaces for collecting and holding water, which led to 5 of these very large stormwater gardens being distributed across the site, designed as part of an integrated system of landforms and circulatory spaces and vegetal spaces. You begin to see a section perspective of how this works. Obviously, water enters the system. We can create something that's incredibly biodiverse here, but we've added, in this case, an interactive technological element, just simple glowing light rods within the gardens that start to flicker more intensely the more water that's entering the system. And so the more miserable the rainstorm, the harsher the environment, the more beautiful the technological lighting effect will be. And so we're finding very simple ways to create responsive environments that hopefully provide new linkages between people's experience within a space like this and the environment and world around them. And so you can see here the trees are still quite young, but you can begin to see the various textures of those gardens and get a sense for the ways in which this is a radically different type of campus space than those that you know from many other college campuses. So the second topic here is urban forestry and green schoolyards. Again, the roles in which, the ways in which the urban forestry in particular can play a role within the environment, and the ways that we can begin to think about biodiversity and tree growth as constituent parts of living landscapes. This is actually a small project in Cambridge, not so far from where we are. This is down near Kendall Square in Cambridge. It's a site that's just over an acre. It's an underutilized site that was contaminated, traffic island, and the city of Cambridge wanted to create a demonstration project for its new urban forestry plan. Our contribution to that thinking, on the one hand, is to think about that in relationship to humans. How will humans use and experience this demonstration project? But also, what are the various ways in which we could think about forestry as a set of practices, even within urban environments? And so the project's somewhat simple. There's a central urban grove that, with a couple of other elements, fixed seating, a small deck, becomes the kind of social heart of the space. But you can begin to see on the edges the way in which we're creating landforms and a lowland infiltration forest, how we're manipulating landform to provide different kinds of growing environments that create different kinds of small forest groves all the way across the site. So this is the center of that space. The idea is to feel fully engulfed within a living environment here, and to have the maximum biodiversity that's possible on the site. An animation here starts to talk about the variety of planting techniques. One of the things that we are doing here is working with bare root trees you begin to see how these things grow over time. We're planting 400 trees. Here we go. 400 trees on a 1 acre site. Some of those are quite small. And the idea with the bare root trees in particular is they're planted too close together. They'll start to outcompete one another. They'll also be culled over time. So the city's maintenance staff will go in knowingly and start to cull out trees that aren't doing as well as others. And so through this set of practices and through the incredible diversity of plant species here, we're going to create something that's really quite unique in terms of the ways in which biodiversity can be grown from scratch on a site that's highly impacted. And of course, you're seeing a whole series of things happening here with seasonal change and all that. Again, the role of stormwater is really important, but this is all happening on an impacted site. So this section is very, very important. We're actually quite constrained in terms of how deep we can go on a contaminated site here and finding the means and methods in order to do that. So I think this project is important. It's probably the one that comes closest to you all thinking about the horticultural and silvicultural techniques that could be put in place over time to begin to cultivate a series of forest environments. You can begin to get a sense this project's still under construction. I love the way in which even the stabilizing mechanisms, the wooden posts here, become part of the legibility of the project, part of the intensification of the project. And you can begin to see the sheer edge, intense edge that's created along the backside of the berm with this project. We have lowland habitats as well that are themselves quite biodiverse. This entire area is designed to flood quite safely as part of that environment. And then in the center will be a bit more of a social flowering grove as well. So this is one where it's a tiny site, unlike yours. It's in the city, unlike yours, but there are lessons about the techniques that are being used that I think could be very helpful, or at least open a window for the kinds of things that you might be doing. Second project, just very quickly, this is a renovation of Venice High School. I think Alex is among a few people on this call that would recognize Venice High School from Grease, the movie with John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John. This is a campus expansion in Los Angeles, but one in which we're interested in essentially growing a forest for teaching and for social spaces on a campus that was largely asphalt and concrete prior. So how is it that you begin to grow a forest here? How can you create more civilized environments for public high school students within the city? How is it that we can, again, use good techniques for capturing stormwater? And how might we create an arid adapted landscape in these new courtyards? And so in each of these projects, you're seeing plant material that is critically adapted to the environment that's in place, with the idea that this fine tuning allows for different kinds of biodiversity to emerge, but plant materials that will be quite resilient over time as well. And you can see some of the plant balance that were developed here. Integrating both existing trees where possible and new landscapes. These were all taken when this project was about 3 days old, using very, very small plant materials that are already growing in quite remarkably. And a teaching garden as well. One of the courtyards is devoted devoted to the science quadrangle and the idea that these planter beds can be adapted by teachers and coordinated to work with their science curriculum as they're developed. Bigger sites, bigger parks, you obviously have other kinds of opportunities. This is one of the premier projects in the office. It's in South Boston, 90-acre waterfront site. I'm gonna try to quickly go through. It's a super complicated site. It's subject to sea level rise and flooding. Here you can see its position within the city, South Boston, not so far from the financial district. It's a super flat site. It's a site that floods already regularly because of stormwater. It's got rising groundwater. It's got contamination. It was filled. It used to be mudflat and wetland. It was a dump, so the stuff that it was filled with is not very good in terms of materials. There are some areas that are contaminated as well. And it's got a whole series of problems, physical barriers to lower income, public housing developments immediately across the street, barriers to the water. It's an underutilized, pretty much a single use kind of site, and it's subject to current and future flooding. And so in many ways, the project has been how to develop a premier destination waterfront park that forms a good community park for those who live closest, but also participates in the city's climate barriers as we begin to think about future inundation. But just as important to the resiliency agenda is biodiversity on a very large scale site like this. Currently, I think on the 60 acres of the park proper, there's something like a variety of only 10 or 12 different tree species. And so one of the big moves here was to radically diversify that, to use trees that could actually deal with the extreme conditions of flooding, of high groundwater tables, and of urban heat island effect to create a different kind, radically different kind of environment within the city. So I'm flipping through a few of these slides, but you begin to see the various ways in which both the canopy and other parts of the park begin to address certain issues here. The plant communities here, as I said, are really quite diverse, radically diverse for a public park, and go from everything from the kind of coastal dunescape to inland wetlands and upland areas, all of which have to be adapted to urban conditions and pretty intense salt exposure and salt spray. We have begun to think of these in terms of ecological groupings or groves as a starting point, but in ways that have a very distinctly urban expression to them. So, we are thinking about things like maritime dunes and brackish marshes on the one hand, but we're also beginning to think about the ways in which unusual combinations of plants can be put together, given that this is a kind of urban park. And so how to create biodiversity, both by looking at pre-existing ecological clusters and by creating our own rich forest gardens across the site. And so some of the work on the harbor front piece most intensely will start to feel a bit more like a coastal landscape along the New England coast, all while integrating things like wood decks and reclaimed concrete, for instance, to create a kind of very raw and exposed environment, one that's dealing with stormwater as well as increasing sea levels. Other kinds of environments in the upland, newly created upland areas that surround sports fields, so the ways in which we might integrate play and recreation of various types within the park. The idea of creating an adventure play within a forested environment at the center of the park with lowland birch forests, pitch pine forests, and other kinds of coastal forests. Rows of giants, which really play off of many of the existing trees that are already there. And you can see the sheer diversity here: lowland red maple forests, upland oak hickory forests, et cetera, et cetera. And so this just gives you a taste of the kind of radical diversity that you can get throughout even an urban environment, even one that's been as heavily impacted and transformed as a site like this. Some of those too integrated with simple things like parking and edges. We're also thinking of growing gardens for food. And that's one thing that you might explore as well within your studio, is the way in which newly established forests can actually grow food both for non-human creatures and for humans as well. It's my dog in the background right here. The very last thing I wanted to show you, which is more of an urban project, goes back a number of years to the Detroit Future City project, where we began to think about successional forests within the context of the city and how we might reclaim some of the abandoned parts of the city for forestry, urban forestry, and other kinds of similar uses. You're looking at an image of the Hants Woodlands, which is an urban forestry nursery that is a commercial venture within the heart of one of the largely abandoned, but not totally abandoned neighborhoods there. It's one of a number of initiatives we were looking at and playing off of when we started to think of the ways in which Detroit's landscape could be radically reconsidered as a series of productive landscapes. And so on the one hand, you had a whole series of community open spaces, which are probably the most familiar to you. In other places, we're beginning to think about the role that landscape could play as ecological and successional landscapes, whether they're on industrialized sites where plants could be put in place simply as successional environments, but also in ways that could remediate contaminants in the soil. About blue-green infrastructures, again, wetland environments, but also the ways in which trees themselves could begin to clean air and deal with particulate matter around highways. And then we also talked about working in productive landscapes where trees and orchards were part of a bigger set of landscapes that were put to use to grow food, grow energy, do research, and create new kinds of living environments within the city. And so those conceptually were how we began to imagine these what you're looking at here is really the same plot, typical plot within the city, a gridded city with large diagonal boulevards, and the ways in which this kind of urban fabric, particularly in those neighborhoods where a lot of vacancy persisted, could be completely reimagined around productive and forested landscapes in the heart of the city. I think this for us is one of those touchstones that takes some of the experiments that we're now doing with urban forestry and translates it to larger scales in terms of what's actually possible when you have a much larger set of environmental conditions, and frankly, a larger set of sites to be able to deal with. And so I think I'll leave it there. As I said, I wanted to develop something here that was probably situated alongside the work that you all are doing, but might start to get at some of the ways that landscape, and particularly forested landscapes, might be thought about in terms of the work you might be doing, but also the way in which resituating a very fundamental understanding of the role of landscape and what nature and environment are could help you to reposition some of the work that you're doing going forward.
This was fabulous, Chris. Thank you so much. Incredible
Super.
projects, very inspiring and super useful. I've been sending the students, in our common chat messages, like check this, check that, and it was fantastic. Absolutely.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
thank you so much. And should we move forward with you, Alex, and then we'll have a conversation together?
Yes, why not? Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Chris, first of all. I think Chris's book with Nina Marie Lister, which they edited, but also authored key articles, is a kind of foundation of my thinking. It pitched me into ecology in a way, in a more direct way than my evolving interests. And thank you, Anna, for inviting me to this, because it will also be provide for me, for my own thinking, an impulse. So I'm grateful for that. But
Thank
I
you.
must say that what I'm doing is a work in progress. So I hope it's not too much of a mashup. And I'm not an expert in bioremediation. And what I know of Amazonia is largely what I'm gathering from your studio and these Zoom calls. So I, like Chris, am no expert. But what I'm learning from these Zooms and is allowing a more aggressive, me to think of a more aggressive way of recalibrating how one might think about urban development, even though you're working with Amazonia. And I'm not going to share a screen because I don't have, I'm going to speak from my notes. And I'm actually going to take a cue from Thomas Quaglia and start with what was coming almost last, just to kind of reorient everyone. As Thomas said, he and a couple of other people, Jocelyn and Grant, I think, in your studio, are in my seminar, and it's called Thinking Landscape Making Cities, Urbanization as a Landscape Practice. And the guiding proposition is that a city can only be designed with a landscape perspective based on a partnership with all living things. And I'm hoping to qualify that a little bit today. The city is built on land, on once living soil, and that land must be nourished by water that is stored, cleaned, and sent to recharge. So this proposition for urban development takes water, living soil, tree canopy, and even agriculture as city building elements. An urbanist is trained and learns, and explicitly so perhaps in Latin America, with their cities which are designed around a plaza, a cathedral, the town hall, and the mercantile buildings. And Europeans have their gates, their walls, and those are the elements which one comes to learn, which nowadays we haven't yet found new versions of. But Thinking Landscape Making Cities is saying that urbanists, well, I don't know if they can do it, landscape architects, together with planners, can bring these other elements, soil, water, as I said, as basic city building elements. And this work begins by recovering suppressed hydrological structures, ecosystems, and habitats. And this can't be done in a holistic sense without bringing the communities and the needs of the communities into the picture. So that's just the context which Anna, your invitation arrived. So what I'm going to do in this talk is juxtapose, I hope not mash together, the 20th and 21st century trajectory of thinking about regenerative design and regenerative development, and set that aside, or perhaps I've not done it, create a structure which sets it aside next to the living history and culture of indigenous peoples, ancestral or traditional knowledge and practice. And as Anna pointed out, indigenous culture is another world. I'm not going to get into it, but I think we can learn a great deal from it. So to these two elements, the concept of regenerative design and development, which I will say latent inside regenerative design and development is the knowledge, is ancestral and traditional knowledge. I'm going to add to that the recent research on the commons. And the commons is a mechanism for the collaboration and sharing of urban, or we can say rural, in your case perhaps, resources in a way that they can be continuously enjoyed and added to. And it's a form, metaphorically and analogically speaking, of gardening, hence my title, To Be a Gardener. So my parts, I want to say one very brief comment about the predicament we find ourselves in, which I call our asymmetric age, which then say a few words about indigenous or ancestral knowledge and practice with some humility, talk about regenerative design and development. I can't go into a history of it. It's a very interesting trajectory. And then talk about the newest research on the commons, a new commons paradigm. And that comes in a very large sense from the work of Sheila Foster and Christian Yayone, whose new book, The Co-City, came out, I think 3 weeks ago. That's why I have all these yellow stickies in it. And please watch Sheila Foster's lecture on the Harvard video. It's an extremely important work, and it's just outside of a lot of our mainstream interests, so it hasn't come so much to attention. I hope to make that. I hope I hope this three-way mix can come clear also when I describe the aims of their work. So just a word about regenerative design and development. Is not a white Western postmodern sustainability concept. It's a concept and practice bracketed on one side by ancestral practices of agriculture, husbandry, and land management, as very well chronicled in the many decades of research by Elinor Ostrom. And on the other side, future practices based on equity, ecology and values, which Sheila Foster and Christian Yayone have worked into their very many projects that have been realized in the US and in Europe. So both regenerative design and development, and as a main part of Foster and Yayone's work, the results have been achieved by new forms of resource management and governance based on collaboration and sharing. So that as a philosophy won't sound so foreign if you've been looking at the Ecuadorian, Amazonian cultures of the Waorani. For example, do indigenous cultures need us? I'll end with Namonte Nenkimo's letter to the Western leaders, and they don't need us. They need us to stop doing what we're doing. but we in the developed world need to learn and understand and empathize, and from empathy learn their work. So I'm going to begin to go through this material. So first of all, to be a gardener, what does that mean? In his 1974 Nobel Prize acceptance speech, the economist Friedrich von Hayek proposed that we live and think as gardeners. And he wrote, gardeners are partners, this is his acceptance speech, gardeners are partners in co-evolution with the living system in which they work, cultivating growth by providing the appropriate environment. And I'll add to this a quote from Reed and Benne, who are practitioners of regenerative design and have been for many years. And Reed's office is called Regenesis, if you have a look at it. They also write about gardens. A gardener does not make a garden. Instead, a skilled gardener is one who has developed an understanding of the key processes operating in the garden. Through careful observations of the conditions of the garden's ecosystem at any given time, a savvy gardener identifies core processes that are impaired and makes judicious decisions on how and where to intervene to reestablish the flows of energy that are vital to the garden's health. So for me, this kind of description of the activity, the sensibility of a gardener is a metaphor, an analog for how we might shape our work, and also what it might mean to think landscape while making a city. So when I use the expression as a kind of context that we're in our asymmetric age, I meant that much of what we want to achieve is far from current development practices. Although we've seen in Chris's work how very far one can go towards making work that will stand in the future and points very much towards where we need to be working. Not only do we have the difficulties of established business, energy interests, and so on, I don't want to go into that, but we are also aware at the same time of the dimensions of our colonial past, the resistance to change of the present, and all of this in the context of an unpredictable future of climate change. So being a GST student or faculty members, how can we intervene, or how can we build into our projects conceptual strength that can form, on the one hand, a kind of resistance to the status quo and break into a new paradigm? What tools and what ideas can inform that? So my presentation is also very much a question. So regenerative design and development is familiar to us as coming from the permaculture movement in agriculture, popularized in the 1970s by Bill Mollison. And then a decade or so afterwards, it was recast for designers and planners by the West Coast architect John Tillman Lyle, working at Cal Poly. But in fact, the idea that this is where permaculture and regenerative architecture come from is a great conceit. These ideas and practices are latent in indigenous or ancestral knowledge of agriculture and husbandry built up over centuries of trial and error. And I should add that it also includes, when we think of indigenous cultures, first peoples, we think of people in the native First Nations in North America, the indigenous cultures in South and Central America, also in Asia and everywhere else. But here I might include agriculture and husbandry practices as they were practiced at small, very local scale in Europe and in the US until the Industrial Revolution, really, until the Second World War. So it's, and a lot of that, there also is a lot of knowledge that recently, which we are currently losing. So in a way, we're in a battle of knowledge. So the interesting inputs I've been looking at for indigenous, ancestral, and traditional forms of knowledge and practice. One is a group called A Growing Culture, who gather together and are devoted to uniting food sovereignty movements. So food is a very important element. And in their literature, you come across things. Permaculture and regeneration are not white Western male concepts. In the US, nearly 70% of farm workers are people of color. Around the world, these numbers are much higher. The peasant food web produces over 70% of the world's food, while controlling only 19% of the land. Food is produced not exclusively by chemical industrial agriculture. Regenerative agriculture and permaculture, which claim to be solutions to our agricultural crises, both borrow practices from indigenous culture. Yet critically, as Anna mentioned, they leave out indigenous cosmology, the understanding the earth as a communion of beings and not objects. So I think what we can learn from indigenous practice was to repeat what was in the quote about gardeners, is the tending, the care, and the weaving together to maintain relationships of balance between living things. People belong to the land rather than land belonging to people. And I think this is an analog for how future settlement should take place, which can be and should be very different from how settlement is done today. So the thinking landscape making cities is really trying to imagine not only new formal patterns of city and landscape making in the urbanization process, but also a different social organization of communities. So back to indigenous, ancestral, and traditional forms of knowledge and practice. The pioneer of regenerative agriculture in the US was George Washington Carver, the son of a slave who became a professor of agricultural chemistry at Tuskegee Institute, Alabama. Between 1889 and 1943, he produced numerous bulletins to advise poor freedmen, former slaves, and poor white farmers, how to rebuild living soil from the depleted soils left by the cotton monocropping industry. Carver created regenerative strategies of cover crops and crop rotation, including nitrogen-fixing crops like peas and legumes, and he popularized the planting of peanuts as a nutritious food crop. His work was continued by Booker T. Whately, and their work together centers African-American technologies and expertise in agriculture, environment, and community development strategies. So it's very interesting that what appears to be something new goes back also in the US. My second input for traditional and ancestral care of the land is agroecology, which is understood as an academic discipline and a holistic agricultural practice. It's a term defining the indigenous and ancestral production systems that have been developed over centuries. Proponents of agroecology claim it is the answer to how to transform and repair rural food systems that have been devastated by industrial food production and the so-called green and blue revolutions that have exhausted the life and productivity of soils and disrupted traditional hydrological systems. People in my seminar have seen a project I was involved in the rural part of Brandenburg in Germany, where in order to understand what was going on, we looked at the early 19th century ordnance survey maps, which in a very detailed way not only showed topography and the settlement of villages, but also the grain of agricultural, the scale of the agricultural fields, and the different hydrologies, where water was through the year, where water was seasonally. This is what I'm referring to when I talk about what people used to know. And in the particular example of East Germany, because of the collective farming in the socialist time and the large global agricultural concerns that have taken over those collective farms, that pattern of the land, the pattern of the hydrology, the nature of the soils has all been obliterated. So it needs an agroecological practice to recover in a much more local way what was there. The autonomy of agroecology also displaces control by global markets and generates self-governance by communities. It requires us to challenge and transform structures of power. In agroecology, women and their knowledge, values, vision, and leadership are critical to moving forward. You know this from your research into the Waorani tribes. In contrast, a patriarchal worldview, male dominion over women and male dominion over the natural environment are one and the same. The violence that ensues has common roots. There can be no sustainability without dismantling patriarchy. So, back to regenerative design and development. What is it? It builds capacity into human and natural systems to stop environmental degradation and slow climate change. Linear systems of extraction to waste are replaced by cyclical flows of nutrients and material. It is profoundly place-based, and its operable framework is the long term. The concept of co-evolution belongs to the redesign of human systems to co-evolve with natural systems, and also the co-evolution of urbanization and the urban pattern with the needs of local and regional ecosystems. No development decision can be taken place without understanding much more fully its effects on the local and regional ecosystems, but also on the local and regional communities. And to conclude a general description of regeneration, normative urban development or urban degrades and wastes, as it's practiced today, normative urban development degrades and wastes resources. Sustainable urban development maintains resources and does no harm. It merely maintains the resources and does no harm. But this is not enough if the general context is one of degeneration. Regenerative urban design enriches resources builds social and economic capacity. It moves from a system of control to working in partnership with place, local communities, and local ecologies. So I mentioned George Washington Carver as an originator of regenerative practice in the US, and I want to make one more reference, and that is to the German gardener and landscape architect Leberecht Migge, who worked in the 20s and 30s. And in his writings and in his publication, his practice, he believed in a circular metabolism between city and region. He was based in Berlin. Cities are unproductive. They consume land without yielding new resources. Organic waste is a nutrient flow to produce food for the individual and city. He was involved, he pioneered part of the systems, which are historical systems of Berlin, of taking the sewage out, piping the sewage out to the outskirts, to soils in which the sewage would be cleaned and then could be used for agriculture, and sending food back. So waste out, food back in. And with this understanding, he wanted to transform the large city and even the nation by the act of gardening, and wrote that human participation in the biologic cycle through intimate contact to land was psychologically very beneficial. So I've described very generally the concept of regeneration and as a basis for design and planning based on co-evolution, circular metabolism. In a very rough way and with some humility, I've mentioned how much one might learn from different indigenous and ancestral cultures and the knowledge they hold. Hopefully, we have some tools and techniques to give them back. And these tools and techniques, one version of them comes from the new commons paradigm being put forward by Sheila Foster and Christian Iannone. She works in the US. She's a law professor at Georgetown. He works in Italy. And their concept of the city as a commons and the co-city has been adopted by whole cities in Europe, and they have made hundreds of projects. So what I'm talking about when I very briefly mention their goals and their claims, this is already in many communities underway, and you can see that in her lecture. So there's a long and vital history of the commons, which has reemerged today in the work of Sheila Foster and Christian Iannone. It's connected with the work of Elinor Ostrom, the first woman to win the Nobel Prize, first American woman and sociologist, and her 30 years of research with indigenous cultures around the world, which refutes completely the claim that the idea of the commons can't work in a market economy. It cannot work in the US. And you may know of the article, The Tragedy of the Commons. So that, her work completely knocks down. So Foster and Iannone in their work have embraced the commons discourse to highlight the enclosure and privatization of city space, and to ask and then to demonstrate in the mechanisms they've developed who has access to shared resources in cities. Their work seeks to empower actors from the public, community, civic, knowledge, and private realms to collectively create and then steward shared urban resources throughout the city. The commons, in an urban context, encompasses both material and immaterial resources, ranging from housing, urban infrastructure, and public space, to culture, labor, and public services. In the city as a commons, they demonstrate that the city, and specifically the infrastructure of the city, as a shared or common resource, is capable of being generative through the collective action of various urban actors who can construct new goods from this infrastructure to meet the social and economic needs of urban populations. Simply put, they have developed the mechanisms by which often unempowered communities can gather, organize, and then make claims on disused or underused property, not to take possession of it, not to take ownership of it, but to gain use of it. In their co-city framework, which is what one finds in this book, their ideas of the city of the commons are extended and reconceived. Urban assets, urban services, and urban infrastructure are seen as common resources to be shared. By the way, in the city as a commons, the thesis of this article is a new form of governance based on collaboration and sharing, which when I read a précis of the article, I thought was an academic, liberal concept. But in fact, the city as a commons is an article in the law review, in the Yale Review of Law. And every point made is grounded in US legal precedent. So if it sounds revolutionary, it's based in existing laws. And of course, they've leveraged that to be successful. One of their techniques is governance experimentation labs, where communities of actors are able to identify and co-design projects that would revitalize or regenerate three types of urban commons: cultural assets, green spaces, and city-owned buildings, and overcome legal and procedural obstacles that could hinder cooperation between local officials and neighborhood residents. Most of their work, almost all of their work, is in the US or in Western Europe. I should say that Turin and Rome in Italy have altered their governance system to follow the co-city framework, which they've organized. In the US, it's something different. It's much smaller towns, but a great number of small-scale projects. A challenge for the co-city framework is its potential to test the power of its approaches to address endemic racism and injustice in the American city, and in Europe, bureaucratic ossification and wealth concentration. The co-city framework has not yet found application in the cities and communities of Africa, Asia, and South America. As Sheila Foster writes, we are still missing procedures that give voice and agency to those who have no voice and no agency in the present, especially in decision-making institutions and processes. So I wonder, I don't know if we can discuss this, in Amazonia, how might this model be adapted for collaboration between part indigenous peoples and the power structures in the state, and city, state, and nation. So I started with the notion of thinking like a gardener. I then wanted to contrast the ideas of regenerative design and development with indigenous agricultural and husbandry practice, not neglecting to say that the former has yet to gain the values and cosmological relationships of the latter. I'm hardly qualified to go there. But Sheila Foster and Christian Yayone's proven project frameworks demonstrate that vulnerable and underserved communities can access urban common resources to overcome inequality, ethnic and economic segregation, access to affordable housing, healthy food, green space, and broadband networks. And I will close by paraphrasing Nemonte Nkimo's well-publicized letter, which came to my attention in October 2020, when it was very well published in magazines, in newspapers like The Guardian, but in a lot of, and subsequently, other professional. Anna, I'm sure your students will know her and her leadership in her community in Ecuadorian Amazon. But I wonder if we could look at her, what she has to say, as if she's speaking to us at the GSD, and I hope through us to politicians, developers, and builders. In her letter to Western leaders, she wrote that indigenous people are fighting to protect their way of life, their rivers, their animals, their forests, and indeed life on all of the earth. And it's time that Western leaders listen. The white man knows too little for the power that he wields and the damage that he causes. So I think I will stop there, and I hope people can keep in mind the concept of regenerative design and development practice, based partially and drawing further upon indigenous and ancestral knowledge, and possibly instrumentalized through the kinds of instruments and mechanisms developed by Foster and Yayone. So, thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for sharing with us all those deep reflections. That was wonderful. Two incredibly complementary presentations, one much more coming from practice and the empirical, if you wish, addressing of all these issues that we're facing, and another one, more about reflecting on all the maybe political and social and philosophical implications of making. I think they were both great and come together beautifully. Now it is already 7:41. You guys have already, donated so much of your time and reflections and ideas. We're very thankful. So I guess we can let you go. You probably want to rest, eat something, drink something. I thank you both.
Get back to work.
Yeah, get back to work. Another 4 hours, Chris, ahead of us.
Not 4, but
At least 2. Thank you for your time and for great presentations. And thank you to all the students as well. And hi to hola a la Católica, un abrazo. And we'll be in touch.
Very good.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Anna Maria. Enjoy the trip.
Anna.
Enjoy the studio. Thank you so much,
Thank
everybody.
you. You too.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Alex.
Bye, Chris.